Okay, let's unpack this. The latest IPCC estimates, they suggest we need to pull, well, a truly staggering amount of CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Yeah, something like 5 to 16 gigatons
Absolutely.
every single year.
Every year. Just to hit net zero this century. It's a number so huge it can feel a bit paralyzing, right?
It really can.
But that feeling, that overwhelm, that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're going to explore a potentially game-changing solution, one that could use existing infrastructure to scale up, maybe surprisingly fast.
And what's fascinating right from the start is just that sheer scale of the challenge, you know. The UNEP's 2023 report really drove that home.
Yeah.
The growing gap between where we are with emissions and where we absolutely need to be for net zero.
Right. And there's all this buzz around new carbon dioxide removal tech, CDR.
Lots of excitement. But also, you know, some valid skepticism. That Anderson paper from 2023 highlighted it.
About whether they can actually scale up.
Exactly. Scale up to meet those really ambitious model projections. I mean, traditional things like planting trees, afforestation, they definitely help,
But can we find things that scale bigger, faster?
That's the question.
And that brings us right to the heart of today's discussion. Carbon-enhanced crops.
Okay.
Imagine crops, the very same kinds already growing in fields everywhere, but with a twist.
A genetic twist.
Exactly. Genetically modified, altered to grow significantly larger and deeper root systems.
Okay.
The core idea is pretty simple, elegant even. More roots means more carbon pulled from the air and stored down in the soil.
So using farmland as a carbon sink, essentially?
We're basically talking about the potential to transform our existing agricultural land into, a massive carbon sink.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, I mean, soil holds the largest terrestrial carbon pool on the planet. It's huge.
Right.
But unfortunately, centuries of agriculture have, depleted a lot of that carbon. So there's a real opportunity here, isn't there?
Reverse that trend.
Exactly, to put some of it back. And what makes these carbon-enhanced crops particularly interesting for rapid scaling, and this is what the 2025 Environmental Research Letters article by Fagiani Dias and colleagues gets into, is the potential to tap into our existing agricultural infrastructure.
You mean the seed companies, farmer networks?
Yeah, all of that. The practices people already know.
That makes sense. So Fagiani Dias and their team took a really clever approach, didn't they?
Very innovative. Instead of just modeling the theoretical potential in, like, a perfect world, they looked back, they looked at history, they asked, how have similar technologies actually scaled up in the real world?
Okay, using historical analogies.
Right. To try and understand the likely speed and maybe the potential roadblocks for deploying this kind of carbon removal.
Moving beyond the lab, thinking about real-world complexities.
Precisely. Considering all those, messy real-world factors, political, social constraints.
So, get ready for some perhaps surprising insights into why agricultural innovation might actually be a quicker pathway to carbon removal than we think.
The urgency around CDR really can't be overstated, can it? As the Fagiani Dias paper points out, the IPCC models show this massive scale-up is needed this century.
Yeah, those 5 to 16 gigatons again.
But, as we said, the current deployment of these newer CDR methods, it's tiny compared to projections.
A drop in the ocean, really.
Pretty much. And that's where this historical analogy approach is so valuable, instead of just working backwards from a climate target.
Which might not be realistic.
Right. They're looking at the real world patterns, how technologies actually spread. And that lets them account for those critical political and social factors that, often get missed in purely technical models.
Okay, so why these specific crops, carbon-enhanced crops? Why focus on them as the case study for looking at rapid CDR scaling?
Well, as we touched on, it's that ability to use the existing agricultural infrastructure. That's a huge potential advantage.
Right.
Think about it. Systems for breeding, distributing, planting seeds, they're already there. Farmer networks, established. There's a body of knowledge around cultivation, management. It's all pretty much in place.
Which is very different from, say, enhanced rock weathering or direct air capture, DAC.
Totally different. Those often need entirely new industries built from scratch. Mining operations, huge industrial plants.
Right. New infrastructure on a massive scale.
Which naturally takes more time and a lot more upfront investment.
That makes perfect sense. Building all that new stuff is a monumental task. So by focusing on crops, we're kind of plugging a new solution into a system that's already up and running globally.
Pretty much. And the fact that soil is this vast carbon reservoir just makes it even more compelling, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's like this enormous maybe underutilized battery we could potentially recharge.
Exactly. And this brings us to the key historical comparison they used in the paper. Genetically modified crops. GM crops. They argue that carbon-enhanced crops share key traits with GM crops, which makes the history of GM adoption a relevant guide for what we might expect.
What kind of shared traits?
Well, both offer potential benefits directly to the producers, the farmers, and both can, theoretically, slot into existing agricultural systems.
Okay, so GM crops are our historical roadmap here. What are the big lessons from their history that could apply to these carbon-enhanced crops?
The GM adoption story shows three really important dynamics. First is the total addressable market, the TAM.
Okay, the potential size of the market.
Right. And what the GM experience shows is, well, global acceptance is patchy. It's not uniform at all.
We saw that, didn't we? Strong uptake in the U.S., Brazil.
But then significant resistance or just slower uptake in places like the EU, India.
Right.
So this history gives us a kind of estimate for the potential land area for carbon-enhanced crops, maybe around 13% of global agricultural land.
Only 13%, based on current GM patterns.
Based on that analogy, yes. And it's concentrated in specific countries and specific crops, mostly soybeans, maize, cotton, canola.
Interesting.
And the critical insight here, I think, is that unlike some CDR ideas that seem almost limitless in theory,
Yeah.
carbon-enhanced crops face real-world ceilings, land availability, acceptance. It defines an upper limit. It's not infinite.
So you can't just plant them anywhere. It's tied to where specific crops are already grown and, crucially, where there's political and social acceptance for this kind of tech.
Exactly. What's the second key dynamic, though?
The second is the speed of adoption.
How quickly it spreads.
Yes. And within those markets that did embrace GM crops, the spread was remarkably fast.
How fast are we talking?
Roughly a decade. From the first planting to hitting 90% adoption within a country for a specific crop.
Wow, a decade. That's quick.
It is quick, likely fueled by, the industrialized nature of farming in those places and the clear benefits for producers. Better yields, more profit.
Makes sense. Farmers adopt what works for them.
Right. And this is a big contrast to technologies that need totally new infrastructure, which usually have much slower, more gradual adoption curves. The paper even uses a metric. They call it takeover time, delta track.
Okay.
The time to go from 10% to 90% market penetration. And for GM crops, the average was just 11 years.
11 years. That's impressive.
So the insight here is, when agricultural innovations fit the existing system and offer clear benefits, they can spread surprisingly fast. Crucial for near-term carbon removal.
11 years. That really does highlight how fast things can move in agriculture when the conditions align. Okay, and the third dynamic.
The third is heterogeneity, variety, basically.
Right, meaning?
Meaning, even among the countries that did adopt GM crops, the timing varied a lot.
So not everyone jumped on board at the same time?
Not at all. You had the pioneers, U.S., Argentina, Canada, moving really quickly once things were approved.
Right.
But then follower countries like Brazil, Paraguay, even China, for cotton specifically, they had significant delays, sometimes 2 years, sometimes up to 16 years.
16 years difference. Wow.
Yeah. China's case is interesting. They were actually the first to cultivate a commercial GM crop way back, but then paused due to trade worries before later adopting GM cotton widely.
So it really shows that complex mix of technology, politics, trade, societal factors.
Exactly. All playing out differently in different places.
Okay, so we've got this picture, a defined, maybe limited market, potential for rapid adoption within that market, but big variations in when different regions might adopt.
Yep, that's the historical context.
Now let's talk carbon removal itself. How do these enhanced routes actually, do the job, grab more CO2 and store it?
The main ways are, first, just more root biomass, simply more root stuff.
Okay.
And second, greater root depth. Research suggests root biomass is way more effective, maybe 5 times more at creating soil organic carbon, SOC, than the same amount of above-ground stuff like leaves and stalks.
5 times. That's significant.
It is. And then, deeper roots tend to lead to more stable carbon that sticks around longer.
Because it's buried deeper, less likely to be disturbed or decompose quickly.
Exactly. So by engineering crops for bigger, deeper root systems, you're essentially boosting the plant's natural ability to sequester CO2 in a more durable form down in the soil.
Makes sense. So based on those historical GM adoption patterns we talked about, what's the potential carbon removal we're looking at for those main crops, soy, maize, cotton, canola, in the countries that already grow GM versions?
Well, the model in the Fagiani-Dias paper projects a significant but temporary boost in net CO2 removal.
Temporary, okay.
Yeah. They estimate a peak removal rate of about 0.9 to 1.2 gigatons of CO2 per year, hitting that peak around 2040.
Okay, a 0.9 to 1.2 GTCO2 a year. How does that compare to, say, current efforts?
To give some context, that peak is maybe 6 to 7 times the entire current voluntary carbon offset market.
Wow, okay. That's a substantial peak then. But you said temporary.
Right. It's important to remember soil isn't an infinite sponge. It has a finite capacity to store carbon. So those annual removal rates will gradually decrease over time as the soil gets closer to saturation.
So it's more like a pulse of carbon removal, strongest in the medium term.
Exactly. A pulse. What does that look like cumulatively over the longer term?
Cumulatively, the model suggests somewhere between 18 and 23 gigatons of CO2 removed by 2050.
Okay.
And looking further out, maybe 41 to 47 gigatons removed by the end of the century, by 2100. These are the median estimates.
Those are big numbers, but it's crucial to remember, as you said, this is based on current GM adoption patterns.
Absolutely. If more countries get on board or more crops are developed, those numbers could be much larger. This is just one scenario based on historical analogy.
Okay, so we have these removal projections. What does that actually mean for the climate? Atmospheric CO2 levels, global temperature.
Right. The bottom line, to figure that out, the researchers used various IPCC emission scenarios. They focused particularly on one called MODACT. Yeah, it represents a sort of more realistic projection based on current climate policies. Not best case, not worst case.
Okay. And under that MODAC scenario,
the deployment of these carbon-enhanced crops leads to a modest but persistent reduction in atmospheric CO2.
Modest, okay. How much?
By 2040, it might shave off about 2 parts per million, going from maybe 434 ppm down to 432 ppm.
2 ppm.
And by 2100, the reduction could be larger, maybe around 10 ppm under that MODAC scenario.
Okay, 10 ppm reduction by century's end. It's clear this isn't a silver bullet on its own, is it?
No, definitely not a standalone fix, and the temperature impact reflects that.
How much difference in warming?
Under MODACT, the corresponding temperature reduction is estimated at maybe 0.05 to 0.06 degrees Celsius by 2100.
Okay.
It peaks a bit higher, maybe 0.06 to 0.07 degrees around 2160, but we're talking fractions of a degree.
So not enough to reverse warming in that MODAC scenario.
No, but the authors do point out that if we had much more aggressive global emissions cuts, they mention another scenario, IMPGS, briefly. Then the impact of these crops could be more significant in helping hit those Paris Agreement goals. It's really about seeing it as one piece of a much larger puzzle.
So maybe not a game changer alone, but it could buy us some valuable time, contribute to a bigger strategy. Okay, now uncertainties. What are the biggest unknowns here? What could really change the outcome?
This was one of the most interesting findings for me. The Fagiani-Dias paper really highlights that the biggest uncertainties are political.
Political. More so than the technology itself.
Yeah. Within their model, political factors outweighed variations in the technical performance of the crops.
Wow. Which political factors?
The total addressable market, the TAM, is the single most influential factor.
Meaning, which countries decide to adopt it?
Exactly. If those countries that have historically resisted GM crops, think the EU, China, India, if they were to adopt carbon-enhanced crops, the potential land area could nearly triple, which would lead to roughly a tripling of the cumulative CO2 removals by mid-century and end of century.
So political will, public acceptance, that's potentially more critical than optimizing the roofs themselves for carbon storage. That's a really key point.
It seems so, based on this modeling. And linked to that is the speed of adoption in those potential follower countries.
How quickly they jump on board if they do decide to adopt.
Right. If their adoption is delayed, like it was for some GM crops, remember those 2 to 16-year lags? We could see a massive drop. The paper mentions an 89% decrease in the mid-century carbon removals.
89% decrease just from delays.
Yeah. It really hammers home how important early and widespread adoption is if you want to maximize that near-term impact.
It really shows how politics and technology are tangled up, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Advances in the tech, like maybe gene editing being perceived differently than older GM tech,
might influence political and social acceptance.
Could do. Potentially. And conversely, political roadblocks early on, even in the pioneer countries, could really dampen the whole thing.
It's definitely a complex web. What about economics? Farmers aren't going to switch just because, right? They need an incentive.
Crucial point. And while the study didn't quantify the economics in detail,
Right.
the authors absolutely acknowledged that things like government policies, subsidies maybe, or functioning carbon markets will be essential.
To make it worthwhile for farmers.
Yeah. The GM experience showed that direct profitability benefits were key drivers. So there needs to be a clear economic advantage for the producers.
Makes sense. And sticking with the technical side for a second, you mentioned root mass versus root depth earlier. Does the paper suggest which is more critical for carbon?
Yeah, interestingly, drawing parallels with studies on natural grasslands, it seems the overall size or mass of the root system is probably more critical for the total amount of CO2 sequestered.
More so than just how deep the roots go.
It seems that way. Greater root mass is sort of an indicator of how efficiently the plant is turning atmospheric CO2 into biomass below ground.
Okay.
Deeper roots definitely help with making that stored carbon more stable, more permanent.
Right. But for the sheer quantity pulled out of the air, a bigger overall root system seems to have the larger effect.
But there could be trade-offs, right? If the plant puts all its energy into roots, what happens to the actual crop yield? The part we eat or use?
Exactly. That's a potential trade-off and a really active area of research. You can't compromise food security while trying to store carbon. It has to work for the farmer for food production, too.
Yeah, a tricky balance. The paper also mentioned the soil microbiome. How does that fit in?
Well, the soil microbiome, all the bacteria, fungi, microbes in the soil, plays a huge role in how soil organic carbon actually accumulates and how long it stays there.
Right.
Different microbes do different things at different depths, and the enhanced roots could change that environment. This study didn't model the microbiome effects in detail, but it's definitely a key area for future work.
Could you maybe even combine engineered crops with, engineered microbes to boost it further? That's certainly a possibility people are exploring. Combining engineered plants with synthetic microbial communities to try and maximize the CDR effect. Lots of potential there.
Okay, so looking ahead then. We've talked about the baseline projection based on current GM patterns. What about alternative future scenarios?
Right.
What if things change?
Right. That baseline is just one possibility. But imagine a future with wider political acceptance.
EU, China, India getting on board.
Exactly. And maybe we successfully develop carbon-enhanced versions of major staple crops that aren't big GM crops now, like wheat and rice.
That would hugely expand the potential area, wouldn't it?
Massively. A much larger total addressable market. And that would, of course, lead to potentially much higher levels of CO2 removal. The paper does sketch out an alternative scenario like that, showing a pretty substantial increase in potential sequestration by 2100.
Okay. So bringing this all together now, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
What are the main takeaways for you from this deep dive into carbon-enhanced crops?
I think the first key takeaway for you, the listener, has to be the potential for speed of scaling.
Right. Compared to other CDR methods.
Yeah. Compared to many others, these crops could potentially be deployed relatively quickly because they can tap into existing agricultural systems.
That historical GM analogy, the decade or so takeover time?
Exactly. It suggests a diffusion timescale that's significantly faster than technologies needing brand new infrastructure from the ground up.
And that speed is definitely surprising, maybe encouraging, given how urgently we need climate action in the near term.
Mm-hmm. The second crucial takeaway for me is the power of political leverage.
How critical those adoption decisions are.
Our analysis, the paper's analysis, clearly shows that political decisions about adopting these technologies are really the most significant factor determining the overall impact.
More than tweaking the tech itself.
Based on this model, yes. Which means innovations that might positively influence political and social acceptance, maybe advances in gene editing, how they're perceived could be vital.
It really makes you think about that whole socio-political landscape around farming and technology, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Technology isn't enough on its own. It needs the right environment to really achieve its potential. Okay, third key takeaway.
The third, I think, is the importance of near-term action and thinking about trade-offs.
Okay, explain that.
Well, even if storing carbon in soil isn't as permanent as, say, locking it away geologically.
Right, soils can release carbon again if management changes.
The rapid deployment potential of these crops could deliver really valuable carbon removals in the near term, in the critical next few decades.
Helping to slow the rate of warming now.
Exactly. Which raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about. The trade-offs between speed and permanence in climate solutions. Do we prioritize faster, maybe less permanent removals now, or focus only on slower, more permanent ones?
It's a really tough balance.
It is. So considering that potential for rapid deployment, but also the big uncertainties around political will and maybe the long-term permanence.
Yeah.
Here's a final thought for you to chew on. What role should carbon-enhanced crops play in our overall climate strategy? In that diverse portfolio of solutions we need. And maybe more importantly, what are the critical steps we need to take now to make sure if we do go down this path, it's done responsibly and effectively on a global scale?
Lots to consider there as we try to tackle this huge challenge.
Definitely. And with that, our deep dive for today comes to a close. We hope this gave you a clearer picture of the potential and the complexities of carbon-enhanced crops.
There's obviously much more detail in the original research paper, and we definitely encourage you to explore it further if this sparked your interest.